Hello, welcome to another video of Code Snippet, and in this video we are going to look into 3 different dependency injection methods which are trying to solve a specific problems with dependency injection inside Spring Boot. So these methods are used to solve a specific problem of injecting prototype bean into singleton bean. Well, let's get started without wasting any time. This is going to be a fun video, so sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Alright, so let's quickly jump into the agenda of this particular video. So dependency injection using ObjectProvider, ScopedProxy and lookup annotation. So these are the 3 methods that we are going to look into this particular video. And all these methods are trying to solve one specific problem inside Spring Boot dependency injection. What is that problem? First we will try to understand what exactly is the problem, and then we will jump into the each solution and we will see how they are solving the problem that we are facing, right? So let's directly jump into the problem. So now if I go to canvas over here, now let's say you have a singleton bean. After that you have a prototype bean, right? So we have different type of beans. So that is basically the scope of the bean, right? So if you don't know what exactly is the scope of the bean, you can just go ahead and check out the bean scopes video inside this particular playlist. I have already covered it. I will add the link in description. You can just go ahead and check it out. Now let's say you have a singleton bean, you have a prototype bean. And now what you are doing, you are injecting this prototype bean inside a singleton bean. Let's say by using auto-wired annotation you injected, or let's say by using constructor injection or any other method. Now you injected this. Now you are using this particular singleton bean in some other bean. Now let's say this is basically a service. Now let's say you have a controller, right? So let's say you have this particular controller over here. Now in this particular controller, what you are doing, you are injecting this particular singleton bean. Now this singleton bean is injected inside this particular controller. Now the singleton bean will always return single instance, right? It will not return a new instance when you invoke it. Now each time I invoke this particular singleton bean, it will only return me same instance instead of returning a new instance, because it is a singleton in nature. That is basically a scope of the bean, and the default scope is basically singleton. Now since this is a singleton bean and I am getting same instance each time, with this particular same instance, I will get the same instance of prototype bean as well. But now what is the nature of prototype bean? Your prototype bean returns new instance when it is invoked each time. But that behavior is violated over here, because here we are injecting this singleton bean, and this singleton bean will return same instance. And because of that, this particular prototype bean will not be a new instance. It will be a same instance each time you invoke this singleton bean. So it will not be a new instance each time you invoke this particular singleton bean. That violates the principle of your prototype bean. Now let's try to figure it out by using a code example. So I have created this particular Spring Boot project by using Spring Initializer. I have added this particular Spring Web dependency and I have generated this code and I have opened it inside IntelliJ. So this is basically the project. Now here if you see, we have this particular code, right? And now here if you see, we have this prototype bean. So this is basically the bean. This is basically the prototype bean, which is just printing that new instance type, and it is just printing the instance. And now here if you see, the scope is basically prototype. So we can just change the scope of the bean by using scope annotation, right? So we have this prototype bean, and this prototype bean will now be injected inside this singleton service. So now this is a singleton service because by default the bean is singleton inside Spring Boot. And I'm injecting this prototype bean over here, which is basically a prototype scope bean, right? So now this bean is injected over here, and I have a serve method which is just printing this particular bean. Or rather we can just go ahead and call the print method over here. Now this particular singleton service is basically this particular singleton bean, and we have injected this prototype bean over here. I will just go ahead and remove this print statement so that I can just directly call this particular print inside prototype bean. And now this particular singleton service I'm injecting inside this particular demo controller by using auto-wired annotation basically. And after that what I'm doing, I'm just saying singleton service dot serve. Serve is basically this particular method which is just printing this particular prototype bean. Now what I will do, I will just go ahead and start this particular application. So let me just start this. If you see over here, our application is basically started. Now what I will do, I will just go ahead and invoke this particular API, right? What I will do, I will just go ahead and bring up my Postman over here, and let's try to invoke this particular API. There we go. And now if you see over here, the new prototype instance and the instance is being printed over here, and the prototype bean instance is basically a same bean. You will see the code, that the code is similar, right? So it is returning the same bean each time we are invoking. So here we are invoking 3 times, and that is returning the same prototype bean. The prototype bean is basically the one which is injected inside singleton bean, right? And we are calling the print method over here. So this is basically the statement that is being printed. Now, ideally, as this particular bean is a prototype bean, it should return a different instance. But since it is injected inside a singleton bean and singleton bean is injected inside this controller, Spring ends up injecting the same bean over here. And because of that, this particular prototype bean will also be a same bean, which violates the principle of prototype bean to return a different instance each time. So that is basically the problem that we are talking about over here. So prototype bean should always return new instance even if it is injected inside a singleton bean. But that is not the case over here by using simple auto-wired injection. So that is when we need to solve this problem, and this problem can be basically solved by these 3 methods, right? So let's jump into the first one. So we have understood the problem. Now we will just jump into the first solution. So let's first see what exactly is object provider. So object provider is a special Spring injection mechanism that lets you fetch a bean lazily, right? It's basically a lazy fetch safely and dynamically at runtime. Now what we can do over here, so I have this particular class over here. So what I will do, instead of injecting prototype bean directly inside this particular service, so let's say this is a different singleton service now, right? Again a singleton service basically, but now here I'm not injecting prototype bean, rather than I'm injecting a object provider over here, object provider of prototype bean, and the object is basically provider. Now when I say provider.getObject, what it will do, it will go ahead and fetch the object of prototype bean for me. Now what I will do, I will just inject this particular service instead of this service inside our controller, and let's try to bring up our application now, right? So here what I'm printing, I'm just printing provider.getObject, right? So it will return us the object, basically object of provider. And now if I hit this particular API, then if I go back over here, then you will see that now in this case 3 different objects are being printed. That means each time we are getting the new object of prototype bean. How cool is that? So object provider simply solves this problem. Or instead of this, what we can do, we can just get that bean and call the print method of that particular bean, right? So I'll just say dot print over here, and now if I run this particular code, let me try to rerun it and let's see what happens in this case. Let me go ahead and hit that. Now if you see over here, still we are getting different beans, and this log is basically now coming from the prototype bean or the print method of prototype bean, right? That is how your object provider solves this problem. So what you need to do, you just need to inject this particular object provider. After that, you need to get the object first by using provider and then call the respective methods, right? Now let's see how this object provider actually works. If I go back over here in the canvas, so now if I scroll down over here, then in this case, now we have this singleton bean and this prototype bean. But in this particular singleton bean, we are not injecting this prototype bean directly. We are not injecting this prototype bean directly over here. Instead, what we are injecting object provider, right? So it's an object provider of prototype bean. Now, what object provider will do, once we call the get object method on this object provider, what it will do, it will internally have a BeanFactory, right? What this BeanFactory will do, this BeanFactory will first check if the target bean, what is the target bean in this case? Prototype bean is a prototype. So it will first check if it is a prototype bean. If yes, then it will return a new instance. Otherwise, what it will do, it will return the same instance. That means if it is a singleton bean, it will just go ahead and return the same instance. So that is how your object provider actually solves this problem. So that is basically object provider for you. Alright, so now let's jump into the second solution, which is ScopedProxy over here. Now first, let's go through what exactly is ScopedProxy. So a ScopedProxy is a Spring generated proxy. So it is basically a proxy based approach. The same proxy that we have seen into aspect annotation or transactional annotation or retrieval annotations as well, right? We have seen the proxies multiple times. It's the same proxy object. So it is used when a bean scope is shorter lived like prototype or request or session, but it is injected into a longer lived bean like singleton. So if you're injecting this particular prototype bean into a singleton bean, you can make use of a scoped proxy. A scoped proxy allows Spring to inject a proxy object into singleton, right? So not the actual object will be injected, not an actual prototype bean is injected, rather than a proxy of that bean is injected. Sounds fun, right? So let's jump back to code and let's see how it works. First of all, in the demo controller, I will just revert to singleton service, right? Singleton service where we are injecting by using auto void annotation. So in this approach, there is no change to this particular code inside singleton, right? We don't really need to change anything over here. This particular prototype bean will be injected as it is. Now, what is changed? Now here in the scope annotation, we can add something called as a scoped proxy. So we can add a proxy mode, which is, let's say, scoped proxy mode and target class. Now what this will do, when we inject this particular prototype bean anywhere, it will not inject the actual bean, rather it will create a proxy of that particular bean and inject that proxy. Now this prototype bean is injected inside this particular singleton service. And this singleton service is basically being used over here where we are calling this particular serve method. Now let's try to run this code, right? What change we made? We just made this particular change, nothing else. Now let me just go ahead and run this code, and this time I will run this in debug mode. Now let me just hit this endpoint. And now if you observe over here, we have 3 different beans, right? So we have 3 different beans over here. But now what I will do, I'll just go ahead and add a debug point over here. And now let me just invoke this again. Now we are here, and now if you see over here, this particular prototype bean is of type prototype bean Spring CGLIB. So this is basically a proxy. This is not actual bean, rather this is a proxy, right? And now if I go inside this particular method and add a debug point over here, then here if you see and go to threads over here, if you see, here we have a demo controller, here we have a singleton bean, and after that it is going through a proxy. So this is basically the proxy, prototype bean proxy, and it is doing all the reflective method invocations. After that it reaches here to prototype bean, actual prototype bean. That means before we call this particular method, this particular print method from singleton service, it is trying to resolve which bean to call, right? It is trying to resolve which bean to call, new or old, right? So that particular logic comes in between in this particular prototype bean CGLIB proxy that is created. That is how it is working. Now let's go back over here to our canvas and let's try to visualize. Now what we did, this prototype bean, we have added a scope, right? So this guy we have converted to a scoped proxy. We have annotated it by using a scoped proxy. And the moment we do that, when we inject this particular bean inside singleton bean, Spring will inject a proxy. Spring will create a prototype proxy. It is kind of a CGLIB proxy that we have seen, and it will inject that CGLIB proxy over here. Now whenever we hit a call to controller calls the print methods. So the call will go to proxy first. And what this proxy will do, this proxy will try to figure out which method to call. This particular prototype proxy will try to figure out which particular object to call, new or the existing one. And it again will make use of a BeanFactory to do that. It will first check if the bean is of prototype. If it is a prototype bean, then what it will do, it will just return a new bean. Otherwise, it will just return a same instance, right? So that is how it works. Simple stuff basically, right? So again, a prototype proxy comes into picture over here. So this is basically a proxy based approach. So if you go back over here, that is how it works, right? Simple stuff. So let's go back over here. So that is basically your second approach. So let me go back over here. So second solution using ScopedProxy. All right, so let's get started with the last solution, that is by using a lookup annotation. Let's go back over here, and now in this case, again, lookup annotation works with a proxy based approach, and this is how it works. So now this is basically another service which is now making use of a prototype bean. Now what I will do first, I will just remove this proxy mode over here. So let me just remove that, and let me just stop this particular application. And now if I run this particular application, it should give us the same bean, right? So let me just send it first, and let's observe over here. So here we are getting the same bean basically, right? So no problems. So that means we are back on the clean slate where we see the problem. Now if you see over here, this is basically the lookup solution. What we do over here is I have this serve method, and what I'm doing, I'm just adding this particular method, that is getPrototype, right? And getPrototype method should give me the object of prototype bean, which is our prototype bean basically, right? Simple stuff. And we don't return anything over here. We return null. And what we do, we add a lookup annotation on top of this bean. And here what we are doing, we are just calling this method, getting that bean and calling the print method. And now here if you see, it is returning null. But since we added lookup annotation over here, we expect Spring to override this method and return us the specific object. Let's see how. First, what we will do, let me just go ahead over here and let me just convert this guy and let me first import it. So now it is calling the lookup service over here. Let me stop this application. Let me restart it and let me just send it. Now let's observe log. So here if you see, we are getting different objects, no problem. So that means our lookup stuff is working just fine. But now let's see how it is working. So now if I go back over here, we have this controller, right? We have this controller and we have this singleton bean. Now we are not injecting prototype bean anywhere, right? Do you see any auto-wired annotation? We don't really have. What we are doing, we are adding a function called as getPrototype. So we have this method and we have annotated this method by using a lookup annotation, right? So it has a lookup annotation. Now, once we inject this particular bean inside our controller, what Spring will do? Spring will not directly inject the object of singleton over here. What Spring will do? Spring will create the proxy of this particular bean. It will create the proxy of this particular bean, right? It will create a proxy. What Spring will do while your application is coming up, it will check that this particular bean have a method which is annotated with lookup annotation. Once it detects that there is a lookup annotation, what it will do, it will create a proxy of that particular bean. And instead of injecting this particular bean directly, it will inject this particular proxy, which is basically a CGLIB proxy in this case. And now what is the job of this particular proxy? Now the proxy will do something like this. So let's say this is basically the proxy. What it will do, it will override this particular getPrototype bean method. And what it will do, it will make use of BeanFactory. Again, same BeanFactory to get the bean, which is a prototype scoped bean. And this BeanFactory will again check if this is a prototype scoped bean. If it is, it will just return the new bean. Otherwise, if it is a singleton scoped bean, it will return the same bean. So here this particular getPrototype method actually returns null. But we are telling Spring that, dude, I'm not returning anything. I don't know if it is a prototype scoped bean or if it is a singleton scoped bean. You take care of it. So what Spring will do? Spring will create such proxy and it will just override this particular getPrototype bean method and it will return the actual method. This particular method will never be called, rather than a overridden method will be called, which will return us a prototype scoped bean. So let's try to run it in a debug mode and let's see what happens, right? So let me just run it in a debug mode now. And we will go to controller first. Let's add a debug point over here. Let's go to serve. Let's add a debug point over here. And let's add one over here as well. Now let's go over here and let's try to send it. Now if you see over here, this particular singleton service is a CGLIB proxy. Now if I go inside a serve method, now this serve method will be directly invoked. Now if you see over here, after this particular demo controller, your serve method will be invoked. If I go inside thread, you will see that after demo controller, your serve method is directly being invoked because proxy will not override this method, rather than proxy will override this particular method. Now when I say get prototype, let's go inside that method. Then you will see that we are going inside a CGLIB subclass and it is calling the lookup override now. So now if I resume, you might have observed that our debug point never came back over here because this method was never called. Which method was called? The method inside proxy, right? And now if you observe, what is the type of this particular bean? This is basically a prototype bean, which is returned by this particular method inside your proxy. And now you will just simply call this particular bean method, right? And it will just print the object. This particular object is being written by this method, which is actually overridden inside a proxy. And this particular method is never being called. So Spring basically overrides this method internally. So that is how it works. And now if you go back to console, you will see that 3 different instances are being printed over here. That is how your lookup actually works. That is basically your third dependency injection type by using a lookup method, which solves this problem, right? So you can just go ahead and make use of any method. So that's it for this particular video. If you like the video, hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe to Code Snippet. Share this video with your friends so that they are also aware of dependency injection using these 3 methods. That's it for this video. See you in the next video.